Hello everyone, welcome to the third and final broadcast in this year's Toolkits Poetry live sessions. So we're very lucky tonight to be joined by Magan Magan, who will be speaking on the subject Writing the Self. My name is Melody Paloma. I'm the facilitator of Toolkits Poetry, which is a 12-week online intensive, which is run as a partnership between Australian Poetry and Express Media. Express Media is acknowledged and valued as the peak organisation for young Australian writers aged 12 to 30, and Australian Poetry is the national body for poetry in Australia. We run a nationwide calendar of events and produce a range of publications. So both Express Media and Australian Poetry are located at the Wheeler Centre in Naarm, which is also where Magan and I are broadcasting from this evening. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects as well to the Boon Wurrung people and the greater Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is land that was stolen and that has been cared for by First Nations people since time immemorial. It is really important that we move across this place with great care and respect and recognise the great strength and knowledge of its first peoples, as well as acknowledging the ongoing violence of dispossession. I ask also that everyone tuning in takes the time to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that they're currently tuning in from. So Magan Magan is a writer and poet undertaking creative writing at Victoria University. He has read his work at the National Gallery of Victoria, the National Young Writers Festival, the Emerging Writers Festival and La Mama Poetica. His work has been published in Hyde magazine, literary arts journal Offset, Cordite Poetry Review and the Anthologies, Shots from the Chamber and the Hunter Anthology of Contemporary Australian Feminist Poetry. Magan is currently co-curating the forthcoming anthology Growing Up African in Australia, due to release in 2019 with Black Ink. And his first collection of poems titled From Grains to Gold, which is very exciting, will be released in 2018 with Volga Press. Launching in December, did you say?
Yeah, December 8th.
Great, yeah. Perfect. I'm going to pass over to Magan now. Please tweet us your questions using the hashtag EMToolkits, and I'll come and present them as well as some other questions at the end.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. Good evening. Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which I work and live, and recognise their continuing connection to country. I acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So before I delve into the presentation, I'd like to read a poem by American Palestinian poet named Naomi Shihab Nye, and the title of the poem is Kindness. And the reason why I've chosen to start with this poem is this poem serves as a great reminder for one of the major, internal work we need to do in order to write the self, and that is to be kind to ourselves. So kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow You must speak to it till your voice catches a thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. I'd encourage everyone to read that poem whenever they're in need of, forgiveness or forgiving themselves, or trying to release any anxiety that comes with writing the self. So in this presentation, I'll be focusing on two main areas, obviously writing the self, and focusing on connecting with oneself in order to strengthen one's writing. But I'll also be focusing on the poetic self, and hopefully by the end of the presentation, both those components will fit together quite well. And throughout that live session, I'll be reading poetry as well to illustrate the points that I plan on making. So before I really delve into the subject matter, I want to go through what interests me in writing the self and why I started writing. So I spent a long time disconnected from myself. And in that time, I struggled with who I was and where I was going. And so I didn't understand my emotions. I didn't know how I felt about most things, like even trivial things like, what did you think of that film? Or the bigger important things. I didn't understand where I stood with those things. And so naturally following that, the questions, what do you think of that? Or how do you feel of that? Would freak me out. So I'd spend time avoiding, being in a position to be asked those sorts of questions. And so as a result of that, as a result of that level of disconnection, I became voiceless. I didn't know how to voice my experiences, what it is that was going on for me, how I felt about certain things, how I felt about my environment, what my environment was. And so I define that particular experience as an experience of really suffering. Because if you can't tell your story, then it's a form of suffering. So as life does, at some point life forces us to really deal with the things that we were perhaps ignoring. And so when I turned 25, I remember losing that. I just stopped feeling young. And so that had made me, begin to acknowledge that my world around me was crumbling. So when I was 25, I wasn't where I thought I would be at the age of 25. And so that really brought me down. And so in that journey, since then I have been working to kind of enrich my internal world, to kind of connect myself with who I am. And so subsequently after that, I began to write, to express, what it is that my body was holding. And so that is where poetry had come into my life. And so the question that I get a lot when I'm talking about writing the self, or I'm talking about connection to oneself using poetry, is, well, what does poetry, do? What does it allow us to do? What does it allow you to do? And so poetry has the powerful ability to make the unseen easier to see. It makes that which you can't see easier to see and easier to touch and to mold. And so I usually give two examples to illustrate what I really mean by that. And the way that I usually learn best, or when I'm writing the self, is I try and use everyday banal examples, or everyday examples in my life, to really solidify what it is I'm trying to say. So these are two examples that I use. So let's say your best friend's name is Sam, and it's his 25th birthday. And so he's having a party at his house, and you go to his party, and then when you're there, you see one of his friends who you've known over the years. You're indifferent about this person. You don't particularly feel connected to them, but when you see them, you have some sort of conversation, basic, ordinary conversation, like how's it going, how are you, what's been happening, that sort of stuff. And in the while you guys are having the conversation, Sam's best friend, who we'll call John asks you if you're still really friends with Sam. And let's say that kind of disturbs you and start thinking, well, why would this person ask me this question? And then you dismiss that, and then you guys, stop talking, you go on with your night. But let's say that question that he asked you has not left you. It's still there, still lingering behind you enough for you to continue on with the night, but it's still there, like it's buzzing. Poetry has the ability to then make that buzzing more seeable. It helps you understand what that is. I'll give you another example. Say you go into Coles, the grocery, and you see someone that you don't really, you know them, but you haven't got the best relationship with them, or it's just ordinary, and you'd rather not speak to them, but you do out of politeness. You guys are talking, and they haven't said anything bad. The conversation isn't toxic. They haven't said anything offensive. They haven't crossed any boundaries. And then you guys depart, and then you automatically feel drained. And you don't know why you feel drained, because nothing has happened for you to feel emotionally and spiritually just heavy. So in that scenario, poetry is making that particular experience more visible. So what that means when poetry is making that more visible and more and easier to touch, it means that you're making connections as to what that experience means. And when you're making connections, that also means that you're having a true understanding of what that actual experience was. And so from that understanding of your experience, you can then take that with you and take that into your writing. So as a good example for this connection, I'm going to read a poem by Derek Walcott, and it's called Love After Love. Love after love. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you. All your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart, take down the love letters from the bookshelves, the photographs, the desperate notes, peel your own image from the mirror, sit, feast on your life. So what I'm going to do next is play a video by a poet named David White, and he's a philosopher and poet, and his work revolves around having the kind of conversations that we do not want to have. And so he argues or makes a point that we need to have the conversations that we don't want to have in order to grow, in order to move past the kind of things that are holding us back.
And the fire's whirling takes different shapes. All things change when we do. All things change when we do. All things change when we do. The first word, blossoms into all others. Each of them is true. Because this has both sides of experience in it. It has the of revelation, of things going well, of being on top of the world, of dancing in the rain. But it also has the driving to work on a Monday morning, losing someone close to you, losing your job, not knowing what your life's about. And both at the same time. And that you're so does not shirk living between those two places. In fact, that's the place it wants to live. It doesn't want easy answers about where to put its feet, because those will be someone else's answers, you see. Someone else's answers, you see.
So make sure you follow David White's work if you haven't already. He's a powerful writer and really understands the human experience and how to articulate the human experience. So writing the self. So when I think about the self or writing the self, I can't. The first thing I go to is the body, because that's the first thing I think of when I think of the self. And is the first thing that people see, the first thing that you kind of feel when you're in pain. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about the importance of connecting with oneself in order to write this self, because I believe that we won't be able to write the self if we don't understand the self. And so the self really is, for me, when I'm talking about being disconnected from oneself, I'm talking about the body and the spirit not being aligned. And this doesn't have to particularly be a spiritual thing, but for me, the spirit, or the thing that is inside us, the thing that helps us understand the world around us, is the spirit. And so, if you've ever, just even walked past someone and you've just felt maybe a heaviness or a lightness, or you've interacted with someone and your gut, you just met them and your gut is telling you, no, this person is not a good person, or not someone you should be around, or there's some sort of darkness. That's your inner knowledge and your spirit. And so when I was going through the journey of figuring out who I was, I realized that I needed to tell. One of the problems that I had was I didn't know how to tell my story. I didn't know how to express what it is that was inside of me. So in order to write the self, I realized that I need to connect with myself and express my story. So I need to figure out who I was, what I stood for, where I belonged, and what my relationship was to space and place and time. And so, expressing yourself or writing yourself sounds easier than it actually is, because in order to write the self, you have to know your voice. And so when I was grappling with this idea of the voice, I didn't particularly understand what it meant. And so I didn't know if it was the way I use words or how I construct a sentence. And I realized that was part of the voice, but the main thing was, or when other writers or other people refer to unique voice, writer X has a unique voice in compared to writer B. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And I came to the conclusion that the voice actually means your own perspective, your own lived experience. And it is that makes your writing unique. And so in writing, once you've figured out your writing voice, I'd also like to say that between each stage of writing the self, so from connecting to yourself to learning what your writing voice is, each step you take, it requires an active understanding that you need to take a courageous step, and also be familiar, or kind of grow to understand uncertainty and to kind of grow to feel comfortable around it, because each step requires you to go into a space that you haven't gone to before, which is quite, revolutionary when you think about it. And so once you've figured out your voice and can express that, you can write that, the next thing you need to be able to do is to write your truth. So the way this world is set up, individual truth is not really, favoured, or, dysfunction is kind of a privilege. And so when you begin to connect with yourself, you start to realise, hold on, maybe the environment that I was in is not for me. Maybe the kind of people that I was around is not for me. And so you then have a responsibility to write what is your truth instead of what you're meant to write or what you're expected to write. And so that can be a bit daunting, trying to confront not only yourself and your own story, but also trying to combat the world as well that is not telling you not to tell your truth. So then the following step after that would be to, really examine the expectations around you, and to pay attention to how your body feels when you're expressing your truth, how your environment responds to that truth. And then you'd really have to privilege that, what you find as a result of that. So if what you find is that in writing the self, either you're battling that or the world around you is trying to silence you, then that's something you're going to need to unpack, and it's part of writing the self. And just an illustration of the journey. Mary Oliver writes a powerful poem about the journey, which really illustrates the points that I'm trying to make in this presentation. In that she writes about the awakening, which is connecting with yourself, and the chaos that happens around you connecting with yourself and your environment. I'm going to read that poem. The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew what you had to do, and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and the wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn, though the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. That's a beautiful poem that I go back to every time I feel lost, or I'm dealing with something that I'm trying to grapple with. I go back to that poem a lot. So now that I've gone through the writing the self, I'm going to go through the poetic self. So with the poetic self, I want to explore time by sharing writing, by activating the poetic self through writing exercises in a bit. But before I do that, I'd like to read another poem by Mary Oliver. This is Wild Geese, and this is a poem that I read a lot when I started writing, because to me this poem exemplifies really the journey to writing and what it feels like when a person starts writing. Or for me, when I first started writing and was really anxious about whether my writing was good, or how people are going to perceive it, and just the struggle of all the voices in your head that prevent you from writing yourself, the self. Wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
Thanks so much, Magan. That was really great, and thank you for sharing so many poems with us as well.
You're welcome.
So I've heard you speak before about knowing a deep sense of grief from a young age as a result of your family being exiled from Somalia, a feeling of being unsettled that didn't really leave, even when your family relocated to Australia. And I'm interested in poetry as a kind of mode of dwelling that counteracts this feeling of unsettling. And I'm thinking particularly of your poem in last year's Tell Me Like You Mean It chapbook, your poem called The Feet That Don't Stop Will Come to No Shame, where you're speaking directly to shame in relation to exile. And there's this thread that runs through the poem of running and moving, and the poem is kind of really encouraging this view of the poem as a space to dwell, to stop and to consider. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, well, because poetry is a tool, or for me, of expression, but it moves between like your experience, the environment, and then there's poetry that kind of inserts itself, to help you deal with that, with that whatever issue that is you're dealing with. And so then time's really important for me. And so and it also follows you throughout your entire life too. So when there's an issue that, for example, we haven't dealt with, the world initially will kind of tap you lightly in the shoulder and be like, look, there's this thing that your life is this right now, and you need to look at it. And so what happens quite a lot is we ignore it. It's maybe too hard to deal with. It's just a lot. We have a lot going on. And then as time goes on, the tapping gets harder and harder and harder and bigger, until a moment where we're slammed to the ground and forced to deal with that. And so when I talk about the heaviness that I felt even coming to Australia that had left me, it was that I didn't understand what my life was about, or why I had so much movement and moving from place to place to place. And that's what I was really trying to grapple with. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the poems that you read as well are kind of meta poems in a way, in that, by which I mean they're kind of speaking to the space of the poem as a place to talk about these things. They're not necessarily directly talking about what that kind of grief is, or but they're encouraging the poem as a space to kind of front up to these things.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you talk a little bit about the shift from writing shame to writing grief?
Yeah, so when I started writing about shame, I wanted to understand what that meant for me, because it's something that I grappled with for a long time, and I wanted to understand why I was dealing with this, why I had like such an intense relationship with it. And at that particular point, I thought I was the only one that had an intense relationship with shame. Obviously not, but that was my mindset at that particular time. And so I wanted to figure out why. And so in exploring shame and what it felt like and what it was doing to me in the kind of ways that made me small, I realized that the thing that I actually carry after experiencing shame is grief. So really what it is that I was trying to work out was grief. So then I decided to, explore grief, because I felt that was the root of the issue, really. Yeah.
Over the weekend, I was reading a poetry collection on the Chicago Review, kind of as a way to, I think, cope with the Kavanaugh hearing. And it was dedicated to women's responses to Me Too, edited by Emily Critchley and Elizabeth Jane Burnett. I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And in the introduction, they're talking about this tendency for people to ask why poetry when talking about trauma, specifically sexual abuse, but I think this applies to, writing shame and writing grief as well, and that there's this tendency for people to argue for language that sort of categorically states the terms of experience, that doesn't allow for misinterpretation, and that people sort of argue against poetry because it tells things slant. And the point that they make, which I think is really smart, is, whose point would that language be arriving at? Meaning that the people who have historically shaped this kind of language, this direct language, are white men. And to conform to that language would be sort of another act of docility. And I was thinking about this as well, specifically in relation to your poem in Australian Contemporary Feminist Anthology, where you're talking about being a witness to sexual abuse and harassment. And I wondered if you sort of had any thoughts about this in terms of feeling closer to a language that isn't direct, that tells things slant, as a way of working through trauma or grief.
Yeah, well, you said the operative words, working through. So, I've heard that argument before, but for me, the reason why poetry is so powerful in these instances is that it allows the individual to explore and to accept where they're at. And so if you can't articulate something right now, that's okay. And so poetry allows for that to happen. And then the more you work on it, you will get to the point where you can express yourself. And this is why we have such amazing poetry from like Mary Oliver, Weston Shedd, and all these other amazing writers and poets specifically. So, that's the power of poetry. And, it wouldn't be okay to just have a, straightforward way of expressing something. It's not the way it works. It's not the way life works. Life's not straightforward anyway. So you can't expect a person's whole life, a whole story to be told that, in a very narrow way. It just doesn't work.
I feel like as well, like writing poems is a very visceral thing sometimes, where it's like you almost don't know, like, why you're going to the poem or what you're about to write, and that it kind of like comes through you. I mean, I feel like that with my process sometimes, that, it's not until after that I really know what I've written. I was also thinking about that argument about this argument of a language that tells things directly in relation to Walter Benjamin as well, who was exiled. And I was recently reading this essay of his. It's a really beautiful essay called The Storyteller, and it's written post-World War I, and he's basically lamenting the demise of the storyteller, which he says is for a few reasons, but one of the reasons he says is because it's because of this rise of a transmission of information, which I think is more relevant than ever in that kind of like global information age. And that kind of information, like the news that we receive, has an immediacy to it, in that we don't like really absorb it properly, whereas with great stories and poems, there's this slow release of meaning that kind of ultimately gets to the heart of human experience,
right.
which I think is what great poems really do. Can you just give us the details again for Growing Up African in Australia?
Yeah,
and also the book?
Sure. So Growing Up African in Australia is an anthology of essays dedicated to exploring what it means to be growing up African in Australia. It's also part of a series, a Black Ink series of growing up. So they initially published Growing Up Asian, and now they're going to publish Growing Up African, which will be released next year, March, April. They've also announced they're going to having Growing Up Queer in Australia. So
Benjamin Miller doing that?
Yeah, Benjamin Miller was editing it.
And those Growing Up Aboriginal.
Yes, and then,
yes,
exactly. So yes, it's just a collection of anthologies exploring the diverse experiences and stories of like the African diaspora, really. And it's really important anthology, especially for this time, what's happening right now in the political climate of how Africans are being talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, and my book, From Grains to Gold, it's a collection of poems that explores grief, and I go through the 5 stages of grief. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and each section deals with a stage of grief. That's going to be released December 8th.
December 8th.
Yeah.
And you wrote part of that at the Williston too?
Yes, right. Yeah. I completed the collection at the Williston when I was doing the Hard Desk Fellowship this year. Yeah, which is awesome. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Magan.
No worries.
It's been really a pleasure.
Likewise.
And thanks also to all of our presenters this year. This is our final session for this year, so I just want to thank again Amelia Dale and Janine Lane. And remember that you can watch all of these sessions back on Express Media's YouTube channel as well, not just the Toolkits poetry sessions, but also Toolkits fiction and Toolkits non-fiction. Great. Thanks, everyone. See you.